And what that did is that it put us into debt. That is the debt trap that a lot of African countries get into. And then the IMF start running their countries by telling them the policies that they need to adhere to stick to the structural adjustment program. So by the time we start taking land in 1998, we're already under the control of the Bretton Woods institutions. And the moment we try to self-determine by taking back our land, or let's call it sequestrating our land that was stolen during the act of colonialism, that was stolen during the doctrine of discovery, we were then punished by the Bretton Woods institutions, which stopped giving us balance of payment support, and they stopped giving us loans to develop our infrastructure and to rebuild from the war. And automatically, that then coincides in 2001 when the United States created its first sanctions through Congress that decided to punish Zimbabwe for participating in Congo, number one. Number two, taking back its land.
Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and I'm speaking today to Rutendo Matinyarare, who's one of the leaders of the Zimbabwe Anti Sanctions Movement. He's a very outspoken political activist working on Zimbabwean foreign policy, and more generally, he also thinks and speaks about international relations of the African continent. I was looking forward to this talk for a long time, so thank you very much, Rutendo, for taking the time.
Thank you so much for your time, Pascal.
Rutendo, can you please tell us at first about your work against the US and I think European Union too, sanctions against Zimbabwe and Zimbabweans?
Thank you so much, Pascal. From the time I left school, our country was under economic sanctions. Economic sanctions from the United States, economic sanctions from the EU, economic sanctions from the United Kingdom, Australia, Canada. And generally, sometimes we define those countries as the Berlin Conference cabal, because these are the very same nations that sat down and created the Berlin Conference to divide Africa into small little states. And we must remember that this came after the doctrine of discovery of 1454, in which they also decided that Europeans were going to leave Europe to go and look for lands to conquer, because there was overpopulation in Europe, they depleted their resources in Europe, and they decided to go to the rest of the world and to conquer the rest of the world. So for about 600 years, Africa has been under oppression by the Berlin Conference cabal that also imposed sanctions on Zimbabwe because Zimbabwe had taken its land. Now, since we left school, we thought that it was normal. We thought that Zimbabwe was being punished for something legitimate, until I started reading the UN Charter. And the UN Charter was a charter created by the Americans together with their European counterparts after the Second World War as a means to try and bring peace to the world, where they believe that we need multilateralism and not unilateralism if we're going to have peace going into the future. And within that charter, I read something that was very surprising, that it was supposed to be about equitability, equality, fairness, and justice, and that no nation has the authority or the power to interfere with international sovereign affairs, and that whatever disputes that nations had, they had to deal with their disputes among each other through the mechanisms of dispute resolution of the United Nations and its General Assembly and Security Council. I also understood that if there are human rights violations and human rights issues, the United Nations actually had an institution with the authority to investigate issues pertaining to human rights, and that institution will create resolutions, recommendations to the General Assembly and to the Security Council for there to be taken any action or remedial action upon any nation that was breaking international law or human rights. And once I learned this, I realized that the punishment that Zimbabwe was going through US sanctions, European sanctions, British sanctions, and the sanctions of the Canadians and the Australians was illegal. I understood that there was no one ever taken to court. The country of Zimbabwe or its officials were being purported to violate human rights, had never been tried in any particular court. They'd never been found guilty. They'd never been given an opportunity to defend themselves. And therefore, it was unjustified for them and the Zimbabwean people as a whole to be collectively punished by sanctions without trial. And that's when I realized that I had to stand up and start fighting this injustice. There was another continuation of the colonial toolbox being imposed on an African country just because it chose to self-determine. And when I read the laws, I began to read about laws created by the United Nations against sanctions. And I came across a 1989 law or resolution 44-215 that said that the United Nations had reached a resolution to say that former colonizers cannot use economic coercive measures against former colonies to force those colonies to create laws suitable for the colonizer, because then that would be neocolonialism. And so this is where my fight starts, from looking at the UN Charter, looking at resolutions created by the UN against the use of economic coercive measures by Western countries to force third world countries or former colonies to follow their diktats in order to maintain neocolonialism.
I mean, it's quite obvious that this is a tool of power politics. Cuba has been under sanctions for 60 plus years, and every single year, basically all the countries around the world vote that these sanctions should be lifted, and the US and a few of, Israel and a few others, they vote against that, and then they don't lift any of these sanctions. And these are unilateral sanctions, right? These are not UN mandated ones. And in the case of Zimbabwe, they used to be connected with the Ian Smith government, the white the suppression of Africa, but then it changed and became sanctions against Robert Mugabe and so on. And still today, the US is justifying its sanctions as a reaction to being corrupt, right? Can you tell us something about the justification and why this justification is just stupid?
And I'll just like to clarify something before we move on. So the sanctions on Ian Smith, who was the former colonizer, what we would call illegal settlers. We had in 1960 the 1514 declaration that said that former colonies or non-self-governing peoples should be, first of all, given their independence. They should be given their human rights. The governing power or the colonizer should give those people education, healthcare, and give them the facilities and basic human rights that they were denied by colonialism, and in the process start making measures to liberate them and to set them free for them to be self-governing. And so what happened with the unilateral declaration of independence by Ian Smith in 1965, 5 years after a resolution for decolonization had been instituted, they decided to declare independence, but not to deny the Black people their right to vote and the mandate to vote. And so the United Nations sat down and they looked at this as a crime against humanity. They defined what it is that the Rhodesian government was still doing, denying Black people the vote, denying Black people basic services, and still enslaving these Black people as a continuation of the 1454 discovery law, or the doctrine of discovery, which is colonialism. And the United Nations, the nations of Africa that were recently independent, the nations of Asia that were recently independent, made sure that they pushed through this issue through the General Assembly as something that was illegal, and they called for sanctions on Rhodesia. Now, Rhodesia had the opportunity to go to the International Court of Justice and to appeal this if they felt that it was unfair. They also had an opportunity to appeal to the Security Council that had the final decision to decide whether these sanctions could be imposed. And the Security Council decided to impose the sanctions. The Rhodesians did not challenge this through the International Court of Justice, and so sanctions stuck because we believe that they knew that they were wrong. However, we also discovered that while there were UN sanctions on Rhodesia, the Americans, the British, the Australians, the very same Berlin Conference cabal were assisting Rhodesia to bust the sanctions. So instead of there being a blanket sanction on this country by UN countries, denying it any fuel, denying it technology, denying it any machinery, they were being given machinery, particularly war machinery. The West were giving them weapons. The United States Department of Defense was giving them mercenaries and financing 13,000 European, American, and Israeli mercenaries to fight in Zimbabwe against Black independence because they wanted to maintain white supremacy. And so we believe that when the Western countries accepted for sanctions to be imposed on Rhodesia, they were not actually imposing sanctions on Rhodesia, but they were actually implementing what I call the Morgenthau Plan. The idea that they had for Germany, which is to industrialize Germany, to deindustrialize Germany, and to make it an agrarian society, was what they were doing to Zimbabwe. So they were literally putting sanctions on Rhodesia to destroy the industry, so that by the time Zimbabwe gets its independence, it inherits a country with no industry and an agrarian society that will be indebted to the World Bank and the Bretton Woods institutions in the same way that they wanted to do the same thing to Germany after the Second World War. And so we realized that they were propping up the white supremacists to prolong the war, because had they not propped up the white supremacists, had they allowed the UN sanctions to do what they were supposed to do, our war wouldn't have been as long. Not so the lives that were lost would not have been lost and would have gotten independence earlier. But the West did not want that independence because we would have had an industrialized country to inherit that would have allowed us to develop ourselves and to utilize our factors of production to leverage our country to a better position. And this is what they didn't want. And not only did we inherit a country that had been destroyed by sanctions and deindustrialized by sanctions. So, for instance, we had a fuel refinery called Feruka. Fuel refinery called Feruka, funded by the Iranians before they were anti-American. But by the time we inherited the country, Feruka was defunct because the machinery was derelict because of sanctions. We had a power plant that was supposed to be developed called 𝗟𝗓𝗓𝗓𝗓𝗓𝗓𝗓. 𝗟𝗓𝗓𝗓𝗓 could not be developed from 1975 because of the sanctions. So these sanctions were affecting the future country that was going to come into being. And so we believe that we were being deindustrialized, but even when we got our independence, the Western nations went and asked the apartheid government in South Africa to start destabilizing Zimbabwe. They asked them to start bombing our pipeline, fuel pipeline, our railway to port, because Zimbabwe is landlocked. They started asking for the apartheid government to invade Zimbabwe militarily. And not only were they invading Zimbabwe militarily, they were invading other countries in the Southern African region, particularly Zimbabwe, which was industrially strong, and Angola, which had oil. So they did not want an oil-rich country and an industrialized country called Zimbabwe to come together in SADC and to form a powerhouse that would begin to fight apartheid South Africa and also begin to decouple itself and become independent of the apartheid South African system, because then that would isolate South Africa and that would end up destroying apartheid. So like they did in Rhodesia, they kept propping up the apartheid government, the Americans, the Europeans, the Israelis, the Australians. They kept propping up white supremacy in South Africa, keeping apartheid alive by destabilizing neighboring countries. So Zimbabwe already was under sanctions when we got independence. We inherited the underdevelopment of UN sanctions. We then got destabilized by the apartheid government, which imposed sanctions of its own with the assistance of the West in the background. We went into war soon after independence, fighting in Mozambique, where we deployed 14,000 soldiers against an apartheid proxy that was being funded by the CIA and the apartheid government in Mozambique. We also had internal destabilization that was happening with the creation of an institution called 𝗟𝗓𝗧, who were actually dissidents that were supposed to destabilize Zimbabwe and overthrow the government. And while we were doing that, we had the war that was also happening with Cuba, Angola, and MK and Namibia in Angola. So you can understand it was a total destabilization of the Southern African region, where the countries that were just getting independence were being destabilized, attacked by the apartheid government. And we lost within that period over $100 billion at the cost that was calculated in 1994 when South Africa got independence. And in today's terms, I think that will be well over $250 billion. And we lost 600,000 lives to secure the independence of Southern Africa and to destroy apartheid. But this had an effect of the countries in SADC. So by the time Zimbabwe finishes that 10 years of fighting apartheid, getting its independence, having gone through 13 years of UN sanctions, getting its independence, and fighting the South African government for 12 years to fight apartheid. We got to 1990, we were broke. The country was literally broke. So we were independent, we had fought apartheid, we had beat apartheid, but 1990, we don't have money to build schools. We don't have money to develop this country that had been destroyed by colonialism, destroyed by 17 years of war, destroyed by 13 years of UN sanctions. So we needed to rebuild. And to rebuild, we needed to borrow money. And guess where we had to borrow the money? From the Bretton Woods institutions. So we went to the IMF, we went to the World Bank, and they gave us the Structural Adjustment Program. And you and I know that the structural adjustment programs that were created by the Bretton Woods were never to strengthen third world countries, but was to keep them under the control of the financial institutions of the Bretton Woods and to deindustrialize them even more by asking them to open up their financial markets so that capital can fly out, or asking them to open up their markets for products that come from the West and the East so that we can deindustrialize their very small and uncompetitive factories. And what that did is that it put us into debt. That is the debt trap that a lot of African countries get into. And then the IMF start running their countries by telling them the policies that they need to adhere to stick to the structural adjustment program. So by the time we start taking land in 1998, we're already under the control of the Bretton Woods institutions. And the moment we try to self-determine by taking back our land, or let's call it sequestrating our land that was stolen during the act of colonialism, that was stolen during the doctrine of discovery, we were then punished by the Bretton Woods institutions, which stopped giving us balance of payment support, and they stopped giving us loans to develop our infrastructure and to rebuild from the war. And automatically, that then coincides in 2001 when the United States created its first sanctions through Congress that decided to punish Zimbabwe for participating in Congo, number one. Number two, taking back its land. Now, the Congo issue is very important too, because Congo is the richest country in the world with the greatest minerals in the world. And the United States continued to control Congo from its independence. They even killed Patrice Lumumba because of wanting to control the resources of Congo. But when we get to 1998, we now have a replacement of Mobutu Sese Seko, who was a proxy of the Americans, with Kabila, Laurent Kabila. Laurent Kabila takes over the country. He has been assisted by the Rwandan government, Kagame, take power. They're the ones with the rebels that assisted him to go in with ADF to take over power. But the Rwandans are getting instructions together with the Ugandans to assist Kabila to remove Mobutu Sese Seko, who had become a liability to the West. But they were also given instructions that whatever government Laurent Kabila creates, that government must serve the interests of the West in the same way that Mobutu Sese Seko used to do. But the problem is Laurent Kabila actually had love for his country, and he felt that the resources of that country should be given to the Congolese people. Congo should not be a country for the United States to get its uranium and for other countries to get cobalt, coltan, and the resources that they were stealing from Congo without any of it benefiting the Congolese people. So when he gets into power, Kagame wants him to put some of his men into the government of Congo. Museveni wants Kabila to also put some Ugandans into his government so that these proxies of the West would continue to determine the internal policies of Congo. But Laurent Kabila refused. The moment he refused, the Ugandans and the Rwandans immediately launched an attack on Congo to go into Kinshasa to remove Laurent Kabila. Laurent Kabila was a member of SADC. SADC was being led by Robert Mugabe. So he went to SADC and he said to SADC, I need your help. We have what we call the SADC organ, which is a common defense agreement that says that the moment that any SADC country is invaded by anyone, then all SADC countries come together to the defense of that country. So immediately 𝗟𝗂𝗂𝗧𝗦 was pleading for SADC to assist Congo to stop the invasion by the Rwandans and the Ugandans. So immediately Robert Mugabe, Angola, and Namibia agreed to send their soldiers to go and defend Congo and to stop Kabila from being removed. And in the background, the United Nations, under the influence of the Americans, had already written a proposal to divide Congo into 5 separate states on the pretext that it's too big to be one country and it's too big to self-govern, so it needs to be divided into 5 states, which would have been easier to loot with the influence of the regional players in the Great Lakes area. Uganda would control one area, Rwanda would control one area, and the then proxies created by these 2 countries would then put heads to lead the other 3 units. But remember, Africa is trying to unite. We believe that the Berlin Conference made us into small little states that are unsustainable. And so now there was a fight with Robert Mugabe, SADC, saying, we need Congo to remain as one. And so by sending their soldiers and stopping this agenda to split Congo into 5 separate states, by stopping the agenda of removing Laurent Kabila, automatically Mugabe became an enemy of the West, because he was stopping a Western foreign policy strategy of dividing Africa further from taking place. At the end of the day, Kabila was not removed, Congo was not divided into 5, and for that reason, because Zimbabwe is under the IMF and the World Bank Structural Adjustment Program, their sending their army into Congo was seen as a contravention of the Structural Adjustment Program, so Zimbabwe was immediately removed from multilateral lending institutions. It was denied support, it was denied balance of payment support. And remember, Zimbabwe was only getting these things because we never got reparations after our fight for independence. Had we gotten reparations, we would have had no need to try and get loans from the IMF or the World Bank. Had we not been destabilized by the apartheid South African government, and had we not been forced to inherit the colonial debt of Rhodesia in 1980 when we got our independence, had we not been forced to buy back our land in cash, Zimbabwe wouldn't need to borrow money from the multilateral lending institution. So if you look at what I'm saying to you, it was an orchestration and a arranged situation of indebtedness that was created from colonialism through to the sanctions, through to the apartheid South African destabilization of Zimbabwe, all the way into getting us to start borrowing money from the Bretton Woods institutions. And that's why they didn't give us reparations after we won the war. And so I believe that this is a continuum of neocolonialism and the neocolonial toolbox being used to keep African countries down, not giving them reparations. Yet when Israel or the Jews were oppressed just for 5 years by the Germans, 5, they got reparations of $140 billion to date. But African countries that have suffered the doctrine of colonialism or the doctrine of discovery from 1454 all the way until today have never gotten a cent of reparations, which is a contradiction of the precedence that has been set for Europe, for America, and for the Jews, and even for Asia, who all got reparations from the Second World War, the effects of the Japanese occupation, effects of the of the German occupation. So I believe that the sanctions are starting all the way from when colonialism starts in Zimbabwe. They get exacerbated by the UN sanctions on Zimbabwe. They get exacerbated again when we're made to inherit colonial debt at the beginning of our independence. And it gets exacerbated by the South African apartheid government, which is a proxy of the West, was used to deindustrialize and to attack and destabilize Zimbabwe and the rest of SADC. And then the IMF structural adjustment programs become another set of sanctions And then we get to the final set of sanctions, which we are in now, which is the United States. Now, they today say that their sanctions are because of corruption, and they say that the sanctions are because of human rights violations. But when you read the first set of sanctions, 2001 ZASM sanctions from a document that is called S494, they're very clear that the reasons for the sanctions were Congo, Zimbabwe going into Congo and destabilizing the Western idea of breaking Congo into small little pieces or balkanizing Congo. And number two, land reform, taking land from colonial settlers. Now, a lot of people have never understood why the West punished Zimbabwe for that. The West punished Zimbabwe for that for a number of reasons. Number one, America itself, the United States of America, is a colony. Many people fail to realize that. It is a colony colonized by Anglo-Saxons, the British and the Germans in particular, and other European nationalities that went into the United States, killed off the American Indians, took over their land. And so today we call it a democratic country, but the truth of the matter is that the United States is a contravention of the 1960 decolonization agenda of the UN. They exist as a country that is occupied by Europeans, and the American native Indian still has no rights and has no access or has no life to the native what is this declaration, the native convention of the United Nations. They have no access to their land. They have no access to self-determination. They are in reserves in their own country. They are alcoholics in these reserves. So America is preserving the colonizers' right to control land and property that they took by force during colonialism. And they still recognize in America today and in American courts today the doctrine of discovery, or the law of discovery that I spoke about from 1454, which is a decree by a pope, by the way. Australia exists on the same premise. Canada exists on the same premise. New Zealand exists on the same premise. Chile, Argentina, and a number of other countries in the world. So if America allows Zimbabwe to take back land and to give it back to the natives after decolonizing, that gives life to the fact that colonial rights or land rights are illegal because the natives were the ones that had title to their lands and property before. But the doctrine of discovery says that natives are non-entities, they're not human. So therefore, land occupied by natives is terra nullius. There are no people there. And a nation or a European nation can come on the basis of Christianity to take over the land. After taking over the land, they institute European systems of civilization and construction, and only then discovery has happened. And that is when property rights begin to manifest themselves. And so that is being reversed by what Zimbabwe has done. Because Zimbabwe is saying the native had property rights. The property belonged to the native. And so we have the right to sequestrate what it is that the natives lost because it belonged to them. That's a contradiction of the discovery law and doctrine. And this is what is fighting, this is what is happening in Zimbabwe, is the fight between these two systems. A system that recognizes natives as the rightful owners and the first owners and the title holders of property before colonialism, and one discovery doctrine that only believes that Europeans are the ones that have rights to property, and property rights only begin with colonialism. That is what is fighting in Zimbabwe right now with Zimbabwe's land. And Zimbabwe is being punished for that. And Congo is no different to this. Where Zimbabwe was invited by the Congolese government to assist the Congolese government to protect its sovereignty and protect its resources from being looted by invaders, that again gives the Congolese the right to determine who can come into their country and their right to ask neighbors to assist them to protect their property rights. The Americans did not want the Congolese to do that because according to the Americans, property rights are what the colonizer or the Berlin Conference determined property rights to be. And this is the fight that has led to the sanctions. So that fact that sanctions are being imposed on Zimbabwe for taking back its land, which was lost and stolen during colonialism, and the fact that Zimbabwe is being punished by sanctions because of assisting Congo to defend its own property from invaders were no longer valid reasons for the West to justify sanctions. So they had to change the reasons why they had sanctions on Zimbabwe. Hence, they started putting more emphasis on the fact that the government of Zimbabwe violates human rights and it's corrupt. Now, your question that all of us started having when we woke up to the illegality of sanctions is that how can the Americans, who do not have jurisdictional authority to be a court or a judge or a jury, punish another country for corruption in its country without trial? How can they punish another country or people of that country for violating human rights when they don't have the authority, when they don't have the jurisdiction, and when they haven't undertaken trials to test whether or not it's for real that these people have violated human rights? How can they try people without an existing law and without a court that has jurisdiction and without a punishment commensurate to an existing code of law for them to punish these people? So again, we began to expose that what it is that they're doing is wrong. And the way we did that is we said to our government, it's time to go to the United Nations. If the sanctions are being imposed by the United States, if they're unilateral, that makes them illegal, but you can't make that judgment call. You have to go to the multilateral institution created by the Americans, created by the West, and get them to make a ruling as to whether the sanctions are legal or not. And so we were the first civil society organization in Zimbabwe to write to the United Nations Human Rights Council, complaining about the human rights violations, the collective punishment of civilians in Zimbabwe by sanctions, and asking the United Nations to come to Zimbabwe to do an impact assessment of those sanctions. Our government then subsequently did the same, and eventually the UN came and declared those sanctions illegal. They declared those sanctions a violation of human rights. And I believe that the UN was actually being very economical with its words, because the truth of the matter is when you deprive civilians of food, healthcare, education, water, you're actually persecuting them. And that in its own definition is a crime against humanity. And with the number of deaths that have happened in Zimbabwe because of deprivation of food, deprivation of healthcare, we actually believe that it is actually genocidal as well, because they have actually instituted measures that have killed a part of our people deliberately for their political aims. So that's a crime against humanity and it's genocide all at the same time.
And I would just like to remind everybody here that we are talking about a country that that occupied Afghanistan for 20 years. And the moment they withdrew, they put the most severe sanctions on them. And while they are screaming at the top of their lungs the rights of girls to education, they starved these very same girls of food and try to prevent even humanitarian goods, let alone food, to reach Afghanistan. And this playbook of unilateral sanctions, of trying to punish entire countries and like just take them out of the world economy, is huge. I still believe, Rutendo, that the one thing that the Americans and Anglo-Saxons never forgave the African continent was not to give in and not to empty out the way that North America, South America, and Australia did. I still believe they want to punish that, and you just have to go to Europe and listen to how Europeans speak about immigration from the Middle East and from Africa. They talk as if they're being replaced, and I keep telling them the only ones who ever replaced other continents were the Europeans. 3 continents we emptied out, and 3 continents we completely eradicated. Completely. 2 continents managed to withstand this plague of the West, is Africa and Asia, although Asia and Europe are really just one thing. So Rutendo, can you tell me what's the current impact of these sanctions right now on Zimbabwe?
Thanks a lot. And before I answer that question, I just wanted to also remind Europeans that what is happening in Africa is not only happening in Africa only, it has happened in Europe too. The Second World War was started because of sanctions on Germany. It was started by starving Germany, by giving very, very punitive reparations after the First World War, in which Germany was fighting for its right to control its own financial system. And many Europeans don't understand that Germany therefore went into the Second World War because it was being denied food, it was being denied the sales of its industrial equipment, that forced it to have no other option but to go to war, to invade Poland, to invade Austria, so that they could be able to get access to food. They did the same to Japan.
It was definitely something that made it very easy for Hitler to get power, and then Hitler connected all of that with with policies that cannot be justified by any means, but it really empowered these people. So what's it doing to Zimbabwe now?
Right. So what it's doing to Zimbabwe is, so far right now, we've got a cancellation of international banking systems. Our corresponding banking relationships that allow us to do international trade, that allow us to trade with other countries, have been cancelled. So if we need to do business in Germany, we have no German banks to do business with. Deutsche Bank just cancelled its corresponding banking relationship in 2001 under the threat of the Financial Action Task Force that was threatening to blacklist the Zimbabwean financial system. So we are having a two-pronged approach in sanctions that are being instituted on Zimbabwe. We've got the first set of sanctions, which is the European and the US sanctions. So those direct sanctions, specifically the United States sanctions, prohibit anyone from transferring payments to Zimbabwe, processing payments for Zimbabwe, giving loans to Zimbabwe, and it prohibits American citizens and any other citizens of any other nation that want to do business in the United States. So that internationalizes US sanctions by what we call secondary sanctions and overcompliance that are forced upon third-party nations and companies to comply with US sanctions if they want to do business in the United States. Then we also have the situation where the United States has co-opted the Financial Action Task Force, which deals with money laundering, proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, and the financing of terrorism. They have co-opted that institution to also ensure that when America imposes sanctions on a nation, they then use this designation of the Americans for their sanctions to also suggest that these countries are terrorists or they are dirty and they contaminate the global financial system. Now that is a contravention of the Financial Action Task Force regulations themselves, which actually say that a country can only be designated as a money launderer or a financer of terrorism or proliferation of weapons of mass destruction when it has been designated as such by the United Nations Security Council. But they're no longer isolating countries on the Financial Action Task Force merely based on what the United Nations says. They're also designating countries just because the Americans have those countries under sanctions. And so these are the two types of sanctions we're facing. So our banking system has been isolated from the international banking system. And so when that happens, countries are forced to use alternative channels if they are closed out from the legitimate financial banking system. And the moment they use alternative channels, the moment they use third-tier lenders, the moment they use third-party people to transfer funds and to pay for goods and services, then that is considered as money laundering by the money laundering regulations that have been created. So it's a two-pronged attack that we are now fighting. And so one of the things that Zimbabweans can't do is import medicines, import machinery. Right now, we're having load shedding, as I was telling you, load shedding in South Africa, but in Zimbabwe, we've been having load shedding since the sanctions began because the electric power plants that we use in Zimbabwe were created by General Electric. And once the Americans imposed sanctions on Zimbabwe, it was difficult for Zimbabweans to get parts, replacement parts, and technology from General Electric to repair and to maintain our facilities or our electric generation facilities. It was the same in the railways. The railway wagons that we use came from General Electric. They came from America. And so whenever we need to maintain these railway wagons, whenever we need to maintain the engines, we can't because we don't have access to parts because General Electric will refuse to sell us the parts on the pretext that the government of Zimbabwe is under sanctions. And remember, there is actually a clause within the executive order sanctions that says that no country, no person can make payment clearances, give loans, give financial assistance, give technology, give software, give machinery, and even to give aid as an NGO, you're prohibited by the United States executive orders. Now, what we say to Americans is they say that we have no sanctions on the people of Zimbabwe, but we say once you have sanctioned a government, its institutions that give basic services and services to the people of a country, that automatically is sanctions on the people of Zimbabwe, sanctions on civilians. And if you read the Geneva Convention, even in times of war, when the Geneva Convention gives permission for nations to go to war and kill each other and attack each other and bomb each other, it is illegal in that time of war to impose sanctions on industries, factories, and institutions that produce basic services, goods and services for civilians. So the Americans, in their own executive order sanctions, have created a specific clause prohibiting anybody from doing business with the government of Zimbabwe. Those are sanctions on the people of Zimbabwe, civilians of Zimbabwe, and that is collective punishment of civilians. And the United Nations Special Rapporteur wrote 2 reports last year, one on the sanctions that are happening in Zimbabwe, and that is called A51/53-1. That particular document talks about the illegality of sanctions on Zimbabwe and their impact. But then she wrote another report on secondary sanctions and overcompliance, where she said every time that a third-party nation, anytime that companies anywhere in the world implement US sanctions or refuse to do business with a country or people based on the fear of penalties from the United States, that is illegal. Overcompliance is illegal. Secondary sanctions by third parties and third-party nations and their companies are illegal. And the Special Rapporteur said every nation has got to put an effort to create laws in their own country prohibiting their companies from instituting sanctions on third parties. So you look at the aspect of when payments cannot be made, we can't pay for medicines. When payments cannot be made to America, Germany, to Australia, and they get blocked in the American system and that money gets confiscated, we can't buy chemicals. We can't buy industrial inputs. We can't buy machine parts. We can't buy grain. We can't buy anything. We can't buy reagents and chemicals. And so this affects our industry. This affects our hospitals. Right now, hospitals are currently operating at 38% the essential medicines that they need. It also affects our ability to create industry. And once we can't create industry, we can't collect taxes. When we can't collect taxes, then our government can't pay our nurses and doctors enough. So we've got vacancies, 68% nurses, 68% midwives. And hence we see that Zimbabwe has had an increase in the number of women that die giving birth. We've got 690 women who die giving birth of every 100,000 births every year in Zimbabwe. And that number has risen from a number that used to be 300. And Africa has set that by 2030, the number of women dying while giving birth should be reduced to less than 70 women dying for every 100,000 deaths. But look, Zimbabwe is at 600 because of the sanctions. When we look at our ability to build new hospitals, it has been drastically reduced. The health budget has been reduced from 10% of a GDP that would have been 3 times bigger now, have been reduced to 7% expenditure. And that is way lower than the standard that has been built by the AU for Africa for 2030. It goes way below the UN SDGs. And these are problems that are being caused by sanctions. The number of students dropping out of school, the number of children that are starving and malnourished has increased because of these sanctions. So they've had a very big impact. And that's why right now we are in South African courts suing the banks, the South African banks, because South Africa is our biggest trading partners. We are suing the banks and asking for the courts to give us a declaratory order that makes it illegal for South African banks to overcomply with sanctions, because when they over-comply with those sanctions, they're implementing illegal sanctions, firstly. Secondly, they are depriving services and discriminating Zimbabweans from banking services without trial in the effort of implementing illegal sanctions. That goes against the South African Constitution, it goes against human rights law, and it goes against international law, because it's punishment without trial. It shouldn't be happening.